Okay, everybody, I think we are ready to begin. I want to thank everybody for being here at the final Shelter Better Task Force meeting. I'm Jen Schneider, professor in the School of Public Service at Boise State. I'm your facilitator. Just a quick review of what you can expect for today. It is our second workshop day around final recommendations. So we're going to be seeing 3 presentations, one from each subcommittee about the recommendations that were brainstormed. And then as a group, you'll have an opportunity to provide feedback on those recommendations. So I'll give a little more information about that in just a moment. But a couple of other sort of housekeeping announcements. One is that on your tables, you should have a typewritten letter. This is from Serena Hinojosa, who's joining us online. She's a task force member, someone with lived experience with homelessness. And she wanted to share her story with all of you. And so I hope that when we're done with our business today, you will take this letter with you and please read it. I also wanted to just make a note that while our task force chair, Courtney Washburn, and council president Elaine Clegg are here, they are not going to actually, I believe, participate in the discussion today. And that is because they are non-voting members. They have a decision-making role. So thank you for being here. But understand if they are quiet, that it's not because they are not engaged. Okay, so here is what's going to happen. I'm just going to turn it over. Each subcommittee has a leader that you chose. They're going to present some slides containing draft recommendations. We'll have a discussion after each presentation. And 2 questions I would encourage you to consider as you're preparing your feedback. One, is there general consensus around the task force? It does for the recommendation. It doesn't have to be perfect consensus, but there should be general consensus so that it could be included in the report as representing the task force. The second is that do you have the information you need to endorse the recommendation? So it occurred to me that you might see something new today that maybe a subcommittee had brainstormed, but you might not have the information you need to endorse it. And so you should feel free to say that as well in the feedback session. And there may be other types of feedback that you want to share with the subcommittees, and you should feel free to do that today. After the presentations and group feedback, if there's time, I assume there will be time, you can go back to your subcommittees and talk about refining the recommendations that you brought today. And I'll provide you with information about the next steps for getting those recommendations to the city staff and what you can expect to see in terms of finalizing the report over the next week or 2. Okay. All right, with that, I think we'll start with the Shelter Better Best Practices group. That was the first group we mentioned last week, so we'll just go in order. And who's presenting? Is that you, Tom and Annie? You're co-presenting? This mic is live, Tom, and you'll just push the button.
Clearly.
That's me. Hi, everyone. Good, not quite afternoon, but we're close. So Tom and I are going to talk about Shelter Better recommendations and things we talked about as in our group last week. So, the first part of this process, we spent many weeks talking about Shelter Better and low barrier shelters. And I think that's pretty much something that we found consensus even outside of our group that is a method and a system we should support. So we really felt like there's a need in our community to continue and to have a low barrier shelter. And then kind of going through what that means, that the requirements for entry are limited or minimal, that anyone is allowed in that wants to come in and have shelter. Encouraging guests to seek resources by eliminating obstacles, welcoming guests as they are, and having clear and simple behavioral expectations for guests, that they're limited duration and that the end goal is to promote moving into more permanent housing.
I think the second part of these two slides are pretty obvious. I think it's the things that we've been discussing for the last 8 weeks. So we're not going to go into a ton of detail, but we want to make sure there's access to services at like emergency food. There's supportive services as well, like life skills, financial health, things of that sort. So we think this is extremely important going forward to recommend from this task force. Kind of getting a little bit more into things that which we haven't discussed here in detail. One thing that we thought, our group thought, was some sort of vetting agency that can vet shelters before they go public. So basically an agency that says, we say, hey, we're going to build this. Here's our ideas. And that agency or that group, or I don't know if agency is the right word, but they can go through and say, okay, here's what we're looking for. Here's what you need to have before you can build that shelter here. It seems like the agency, and I know Our Path Home isn't necessarily an agency, but it seems like they would be the vetting organization. They could review the proposed shelter, affordable housing projects as well before they move into the CUP process, and they can ensure that those shelters or housing projects kind of meet minimum criteria for location, the size, population that they serve, the neighborhood outreach that's going to happen, and they're provided with service, what kind of services they provide. Oh, this one's you.
So one of the things we were talking about as a group last week and kind of brainstorming is all of the things that we've talked about and not talked about around conditional use permits. And from what we heard in terms of zoning, there aren't a lot of spaces where conditional use permits, which are required for the shelter, have available space in the city. So one of the things just in looking at conditional use permits specifically is how often is the permit revisited? Are the conditions that must be maintained reviewed by planning and zoning, and at what frequency? And then what or who is enforcing the outlines of the conditional use permit, and what happens if the terms aren't followed? Just questions that we think, in looking it up, there wasn't a lot of information available on how, after the permit is accepted and completed, what happens next. So just information that we thought might be helpful.
So next, we talked about some possible innovative practices that we can look at beyond just the shelter model. And these are just a few of the ideas that we have. There's clearly many more innovative things you can do. These three I came up with, or I didn't come up with them. These are kind of my head mostly. I lived in Eugene before I lived here, and Eugene's has a huge problem of homelessness. A lot of people who need shelter, and for many different reasons, but I was Googling it, looking it up over the weekend, and I realized they're doing all these pretty neat, innovative things there. And then I realized they have the highest homeless percentage of people in the country. It's a city with the biggest homeless population per capita. So, so there's 3 innovative practices, and each of these slides will be about that, innovative ideas. 2 of the slides will be about that. One is a group called Cahoots. One is residential work programs, and one is a spot called Opportunity Village. And then I put some apps on there too. There's a number of different apps that homeless people can use to find shelter and find jobs and things like that. So go back to the one I was on. Yeah. So One thing I don't have an extra slide on here about is residential work programs, but there's models for residential work programs all around the country where people go out. I mean, it's kind of like the Civilian Conservation Corps back in the 1930s. A lot of opportunity for people where they live somewhere and they work somewhere, and while they're doing that, they can go through the different counseling they need, get IDs, things of that sort, and then learn some of the critical work skills they might need going forward. So next. These are some photos of a spot called Opportunity Village. And Opportunity Village is basically, it's a little, it's a couple acres of land in Eugene, which is filled with tiny houses. Tiny houses were, these tiny homes were built in partnership with a number of different architecture firms and building organizations, builders, mostly through donations. And they house about, I think there's like 20 or so, 25 of them in this one location. And they are free housing, but they are for folks who are kind of going from the next step from, they've already gone through a shelter. They're in the process of finding a forever home, or at least an apartment, I think. And this is kind of the in-between step. It's had great success, and it's a really neat program. So, and you can see these are pretty easy to, relatively easy to build. They're inexpensive. They can have high density on one piece of property. Problem in Boise is we can't have them. It's against our zoning rules. So I know the city council is looking at changing some of those laws going forward. But as of right now, this actually could not exist in Boise. Next. Nexus Cahoots. That's Leslie Nope. She's positive and fun. Cahoots is a organization also based in Eugene that it stands for Crisis Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. And basically it is an organization that when someone is having trauma, basically if someone is having some sort of personal emergency, I guess, instead of the police showing up, you know, an armed police force showing up, it's folks who show up who are, they're trained for de-escalation. And I think it's usually an EMT or a nurse, and then a second person who has, who's like a social worker or has some sort of social working skills. They're not law enforcement officers, and they don't carry any sort of weapons. It's a nonprofit organization funded through donations, through grants, things of that sort. What's pretty interesting is in the city of Eugene, 17% of police calls actually go to Cahoots. The city of Eugene's police force has an $80 million budget, but Cahoots' total annual budget is 1.8 million, I think, 1.9 million. So in addition to it being a pretty cool thing overall, it's also a huge cost saving. So the question is if it's illegal in Idaho, and we're not totally sure. There's some, you know, we can take a deep dive, you know, at some point and look at those, what the laws are in Idaho. One thing that, you know, this isn't necessarily like an interfaith sanctuary should be doing this. This is something the city should probably take on in partnership with Our Path Home, the police department, things of that sort. But it is a kind of side that would help in this type of situation. Those are my slides. Your turn.
Yeah, so this one says community criteria. And I think the thing that we figured out, it's not the thing I think, we figured out pretty quickly that Shelter Better doesn't just represent the shelter and their responsibility or that this is a complicated process. This involves really all three of the areas and even more of the groups that got together last week. So I'll talk about, you know, our community criteria that seemed really important to us throughout this process. We talked about having outreach ambassadors in the neighborhoods. Just even Tom and I know a lot of people in our neighborhood and now have become really well informed on this topic specifically. And I think having people that are able to talk to neighbors early on in the process and be more well informed would be really useful. There has been a lot of community pushback And a lot of that is due to misinformation. And so having a system in place to get out earlier. Oh, these slides are a little different than the ones I have, but that's okay. Yeah, so identify and engage people who are in the neighborhood and talk with them about what their perceived impacts are, talk with them about the information that we actually have about how a shelter or any sort of shelter in their neighborhood will actually impact or not impact. One of the really cool things about doing that is not only does it include the outreach ambassadors, but it's a really good way to get community buy-in at an earlier time. And it tends to be, as we've been looking at shelter better models, an important step in the process.
Yeah, I can add a little more to that one.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, I think kind of the point of the outreach ambassadors type of thing might be, if you look back at this process in the beginning, and we mentioned this before, if Interfaith Sanctuary were to start over again, in November, they would definitely do things differently. And at the time, we don't know, it'd be hard to say back in November, October, whenever that was, where we'd be in August of 2021. But one thing is kind of blanking the neighborhoods more and with informed people to go door to door to talk to folks about what this is. Because there's a lot of misinformation, as Annie said. It's also, and a lot that's just kind of, and there's a lot of concern as well. And I think it's really important to hear the concern of the neighbors right off the bat from the beginning, so we can start working, or so the organization can start working with the neighbors to figure out how to alleviate those. So next, wait, do I have it? So, next criteria is a good neighborhood agreement. And I think this is, I'm going to guess a different group might talk about this more in detail, but this is something that I think Interfaith Sanctuary already does. And it's a way to, I think it's an actual legal binding agreement between the neighborhoods and Interfaith Sanctuary to ensure that there's accountability amongst all the fears that happen with those neighbors. So getting the neighbors, businesses, shelter staff together to create a positive communication and plan together should happen right from the beginning. And then there should be some sort of accountability going forward. There's some sort of way to make sure that's happening.
Yeah, I think it's just important to note that this is a step Interfaith is already willing to take. That this is something they've done before, and in talking in our group and with Jody specifically, it is a contract to hold IFS accountable for becoming and continuing to be a good neighbor. I think a lot of what we've heard is fear about that not being the case. And so just recognizing that they're taking steps and they're willing to create a contract with our neighborhood to make sure that they're holding up their end of the bargain. They want to be a good neighbor. That's the intention. And so just having this in place.
Technology problem. Oh, this is the original. Okay, there we go. This last slide. Oh, I think we added one, but then we sent you the wrong one on mistake. So we have one more slide. I'm sorry. You want me to do this?
Go ahead.
We had one more slide, and it was a picture of an elephant, because there's an elephant in the room. But then I was kind of thinking about it, and I think it's more like the bull in the china shop. And it's basically, this whole process, we got together, 8 weeks ago, 2 months ago. And I think kind of for us, the big reveal at the end was going to be what are the alternative sites. And when it comes down to is we had a list of 60-ish sites that Then we had some certain criteria, costs. They had to be correctly zoned and they had to be available. There might have been some more criteria, I know. But when it came down to it, we looked at all those different sites around the city, and there was only one that met all the criteria, which is kind of mind-blowing. And it's interesting that clearly Interfaith Sanctuary knew that, and they did their research before, a long time ago. So we need to, as the task force, we need to understand that there isn't a whole lot of wiggle room with that. So, and it's unfortunate. I think we were all excited and we were looking forward to trying to find these different spots, but they don't exist, at least not right now. And the kind of second, to me at least, the second kind of elephant in the room or bull in the china shop is the zoning regulations within the city. Part of the reason, or actually the main reason why there's only one location is zoning, the city zoning laws. You can't put a homeless shelter on any sort of residential land. Anything zoned residential has to be something zoned commercial, and then you have to get a CUP, a conditional use permit, to do it. And so at the end of the day, I think we need to take a look at the zoning rules. In addition to that, you can't, in Idaho or in Boise, rules prohibit things like some sorts of it. I don't know a lot about. I'm not a zoning genius by any hands, but they're really hamstringing how much density we can have in the city, like those tiny homes, things of that sort. Like that's against the rules and against zoning laws in Boise. So we need to take a look at it as a city. I'm going to ask the city council to take a look at that. I know they already are, and it's already on their list. I also want to recognize though, so if we were to go through and rezone or change the zoning laws so you can put a homeless shelter in a residential community, that's going to create all kinds of issues as well. So there's no easy decisions. There's no easy answers to this, clearly. But we need to look at it. We need to figure it out. We need to find what's best for our population, both the city, the neighbors, the people served, and the organization.
I mean, I think Tom put it beautifully. This is the spot. I think one of the unfortunate parts about this as we look at Shelter Better is this was information that maybe wasn't available before, but if it had been, we'd be having a different conversation about this whole process. And I think a lot of the onus was put on IFS. And I think that's unfortunate given that having the information about actual available spots, that this is the spot. So I guess our ultimate hope, the other thing we were kind of talking about is that I think this was a new process. And one of the great things about trying something new is that there are a lot of opportunities through learning, through missteps and through positive steps. And so our hope is just that this will be a guide and informative in the future as needed, or for helping find locations for additional shelters, if that is the case.
All right, thanks so much. Appreciate you two presenting. Do you want to have a seat for the discussion section of things? Do you want to stay up? What makes sense? Maybe toward your group.
We have microphones.
Okay.
So.
All right. Sounds good. So I added one more maybe guiding questions, and these are just suggestions, but as I was listening, it also occurred to me that there might be things that you feel like are missing in a particular section, and you should feel free to bring that up as well, based on what you've learned on the task force. So the one thing I would just say is that I saw a number of recommendations in that presentation, and then I saw some things that didn't look like recommendations. And so maybe there will be some questions around that, but I do want to open things up to the group for this subcommittee on best practices in terms of what you'd like to see included in the final report. And just if you speak, a reminder to please introduce yourself for folks who are watching online. Okay, Katie.
So I have two comments, and one would be I would still push back on the "this is the spot" narrative a little. Of the 6 peer cities, I think 4 of them didn't have parcel sizes between 1 and 3 acres, for instance. I think that you could still go more deeply in that land scan before just writing off any other parcel in Boise. Oh. And secondly, one potential best practice that I didn't see specifically addressed there would be heavier reliance on the coordinated entry system. I think that having a shelter where all of the bed availability was managed through coordinated entry rather than on-site walk-up would alleviate concerns about overflow and inability to accommodate overflow, and that spreading out into neighborhood when there's not enough space for people.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Charity.
Hello, Charity Nelson. There was a bullet point in the presentation that said limited duration with transition to permanent solutions. I think what you meant is that's the goal, and I'm in total agreement, but I just want to make sure it doesn't come off that there is a limited duration. I believe that it functions today, that of course the goal is that we move people to permanent solutions, but there's also not a point at which we're going to kick them back out to the streets. So I would recommend that there's a change to that to indicate that if the group is in agreement.
Yeah, I'll say that we maybe weren't clear enough in outlining the bullet point, but that was the general understanding of what we meant. Yeah.
Thanks, Annie. Okay, Jet.
That was one of my points as well. This is Jeanette Curtis. I'm the director of the street outreach team. And I just want to make sure that we're all very careful about the limitations of time. In this housing market, it's so incredibly difficult to get people housed. So that would put a real barrier on the homeless service agencies. I wanted to thank you for bringing up Cahoots. They are a role model. They've been around for a really long time and they've got some great outcomes. And so we have been looking at them for a while. Boise does have a system put together that's similar, though we're always looking for, how can we improve that? But we have a partnership with the Boise Police Office Behavioral Health Units. They have 2 units that go out with mental health counselors and officers, and then Department of Health and Welfare Mobile Crisis Unit. And the outreach team is part of that partnership as well. So we do have something like that. And I think that's an important recommendation to continue to put forward in what a shelter system looks like in our area, that we have those response teams active and ready to launch.
So this is where I need help and my city partners might need help in terms of what does that recommendation look like? Like this group hasn't studied Cahoots, but there is a similar model working in Boise. So is the recommendation simply to continue investing in that, to build it out? What feels good?
I think both of those things. And we, in our community group, had a similar recommendation about proactive and responsive. I can't remember what we said exactly, but like safety response for people having mental health crises, for neighbors having concerns, that we have like a really strong system that's in place for wherever we have shelters built.
Yeah, that's a great point. Sorry, Tom, go ahead.
I want a clarification on the Boise program. From what I read, it's the mental health specialist usually rides along with the police whereas in this case, the big difference is Cahoots, there's no police at all unless there's something that they call them later on. So
yeah,
it
is different.
Yeah,
I
guess the recommendation would be from our group would be to continue that program, but look at different ways of doing it so we can get further away from having police officers while doing the welfare checks and other things of that sort.
Mm-hmm. It's a good point. And then I just had one final recommendation as far as a gap goes about making sure that we, in whatever shelter system, and I mean system, not one shelter location, that we are covering the reasons why our current unsheltered population don't access the shelters. We talked a little bit about the data that we've collected for reasons why people don't access shelter. And sometimes it's because it is crowded and chaotic, and that can exacerbate mental health symptoms. But we also talked about Partners, pets, possession, and parking. So partners like not separating families, which we have an interfaith sanctuary. And as we expand shelter, we would want to continue to make sure that that was low barrier. We have a lot of folks who don't access shelter because of parking and because of pets. And because of possessions. And those are things we need to think about as we're building out a shelter system.
Thank you. So I just want to go back to the Cahoots discussion. So this is one of those areas where as a facilitator, I just think you'll have to pay attention to the language because this group hasn't studied Cahoots specifically. And so I could see that you could make a broad recommendation about improving behavioral health unit access training. And then you could say something along the lines of, and perhaps programs like Cahoots could serve as a model, as opposed to we should do Cahoots, right? Do you hear the difference? Simply because we have to get to some consensus and we haven't done a deep dive in this group on that. So I think you can mention it, you can refer to it, but you just have to be careful how you frame it up. Does that, Tom, how does that feel to you?
Am I writing the final recommendation?
Yes, Tom, I forgot to tell you that you're writing the report. No,
also gonna have-
you'll give us bullet points.
Okay.
The city will write it up. You'll have a chance to review what they write. But I didn't want to anybody to be surprised if you see that change.
Yeah.
Okay. Was there another hand before Sarah? Okay, yeah, Stephanie.
Stephanie Day with Catch, and I was a part of this group. And so obviously I'm going to put forward the recommendation that we do develop some kind of an Our Path Home certification or stamp of approval for projects like this moving forward. For those of you who aren't familiar, we have an amazing group of very talented professionals in the field that make up Our Path Home. So B represents people fleeing domestic violence. We have the Veterans Administration. We have the Boise City Ada County Housing Authority. We have developers in that group. Catch obviously is in that group, but it's a very knowledgeable group of folks that kind of plan the strategic efforts in our community around ending homelessness. And I think that it would be a great idea for expansion of projects like this, day shelter, anything kind of related to this, that we could come up with a process to evaluate a business plan, a funding plan, best practices analysis, and then not necessarily have to go through a process like this with everyone. I mean, we could do like community education events, but hopefully have that group kind of vet projects that are put forward in the future.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. We have a clarifying question. Yes.
So thanks for that. I guess my clarifying question is, this vetting process would happen how and when? And are you talking about using it with whatever comes forward out of this group or waiting until another time?
This would be a recommendation for moving forward. I think that this ship has already sailed. And like this group kind of did a lot of that work together, but I think a lot of the members of this group have kind of been feeling like, well, I'm not an expert, like you're telling me this information, but what do I do with it? So yes, this would be a recommendation for projects moving forward. And my thought would be that like we work together very closely as partner organizations. Like as soon as an entity was like, hey, I want to do this, we take it to the executive committee and we start working on it from there.
Jody, and then I want to make sure we get to Sarah has a question.
Yeah, and just to further clarify, Interfaith Sanctuary is on the Our Path Home Committee, and this project has been in front of them for as long as we've dreamed of it. So we've had the experts really helping and guiding us. So moving forward, I think it's more about putting the criteria together so that it can go out to people to see, and maybe they have some feedback about what they'd like to see, but it's a starting point. But the agency support would be around anything that would be moving into the community to support those without homes.
So formalizing that process. Okay. I had Sarah and then B. And we'll work our way around. Okay.
I'm Sarah. I have two quick things. That one, going back to the language around safety and partnerships, and because this will come up in the community criteria group that I was a part of, which we sort of named the recommendation to have a team or the shelter entity have with neighbors have a system for addressing gaps in safety and emergency services as part of the proactive approach, recognizing that the growth rate of the city and the need for homeless services growing alongside that might necessarily mean that there will always be something of a gap. We'll always be running to catch up in some kind of way. And so thinking for alternative strategies to address those gaps, like our current partnerships with the street outreach team, like a model of Cahoots, like in just kind of thinking through the language requests that you were making, Jen. And then the other thing I think I want to name in these recommendations that I know Interfaith named in their presentation, and I know as part of shelter better practices, but I felt important to highlight was a recommendation around focusing on day shelter capacity and alternatives, because that really continued to rise as a deep need for us very specifically in our city.
Okay, so just again, a point of order, maybe group 1 and group 2 subcommittee chairs should get together and decide if sort of policing safety stuff should go in both buckets or if it's better appearing in one. You could have that discussion. Okay, B and then Hillary.
Thank you. B Black with the WCA. One of the things that has occurred to me as I've listened to the comments and the testimony and all the presentations is I would love to see a recommendation come out of this shelter better practice. I don't believe that IFS ever went into the business to be a long-term housing solution. And so with all of the interest, with all the thoughts, with all the comments, I would love to see one of the recommendations be that we more proactively move to help create more opportunities to house those who need long-term housing. They are not simply waiting to leave homelessness. They basically will continue to be homeless unless we can put together more housing opportunities like Valor Point and like New Path Home. And those would, I would think, be smaller shelters, if you want to call it that. They would have the wraparound services. And I would like to think that given all the interest around this topic, that there would be individuals that would be willing to really start working on that. Because I think as you all have seen through this is not easy. It takes resources and it takes investment and it takes a will to do that. I think IFS has stepped up and been filling a need which I don't see anybody else really doing. So I think we need to support this moving forward because this is where we are right now. But I think this should be a pathway to helping with those other populations that really need our support.
Thank you. Okay, so Hillary and then Andrew, and then I'd like to move on to group 2 just so we can make sure to hear from everybody today. You'll still have opportunities to weigh in on the written draft of the report. Okay.
All right, so I'll do 2 quick comments. First off, we talked about CUP enforcement. I just want to make sure that this would be an equitable type of enforcement because there are multiple CUP permits throughout the city, and just starting to focus on one type or one area of CUP could be very problematic. So I would like to ensure that there's equity around the CUP enforcement. And then secondly, for all these weeks, we have been talking about shelter better practices and site criteria. And those 2 things do overlap to some extent. But then last week we learned about inherent restrictions within the city policies and their planning and zoning. And it seems like all that got thrown away because of the inherent restrictions that already exist. So when you talk about only 7% of property available, only available with a conditional use permit, and then maybe it got a great bus line in it. I mean, it hits their budget, it hits their minimum requirements. I'm still not saying that it's necessarily the best place, but based on the current city criteria, this is really a unicorn for IFS. So unless the city is going to be able to expedite rezoning or any other solutions, I don't see how IFS as a private business entity can't go forward unless the city is going to step up and make those changes and expedite those changes and facilitate that part of it.
Thank you, Hillary. Sorry, one last comment. Can someone hand a mic over? Thank you.
I've always said content's easy, packaging is hard. So the elephant in the room slide, it seems to me, is something you should bring back up when the third group presents about recommendations to leadership, so that we keep clear that these are points on what better shelter looks like, and leading a process towards that is a recommendation for leadership, I think.
Yeah, so there may need to be some discussion around subcommittee leads again around what goes where. So I will make sure that you're in touch with one another as you make those recommendations to us. Okay, I want to move on to group 2, which is our community criteria group. Let's see, Rachel, are you able to take a picture of this? Rachel, make sure you get pictures of the board because I know you can't see it in the back of the room. I just want to make sure I capture feedback. And we'll put it up online as well for folks who are online.
All right.
Rachel, you got it?
Okay, so we're going to talk about the community criteria. So we're looking at this from the lens of the community. We identified a few areas of concern: community engagement, good neighbor agreements. And I will say a lot of this is going to be repeated from that first one. So we all had some really similar ideas. We're looking at more proactive emergency and security plans, appropriate buffers per the size of the shelter. And then again, we're going to touch into that accountability after the conditional use permit. So some specific recommendations, and maybe these do go into the third slide, but they touch from the community lens. Apparently Boise Police Department has an impact report that they can do. It would be really nice to see that wherever a shelter is cited, not just the shelter, that PPD comes in and identifies areas of potential impact for safety, such as needs for new lighting, new street lighting, new area lighting. We really want to focus on being proactive rather than reactive. Also, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the community engagement plan and a proactive safety plan. Okay, so let's talk about this community engagement board. I think where we missed here is, we had this opportunity to put a shelter in a location, and then we got the neighbors and we had a lot of response. And I think this gives us an opportunity to engage more. We'd like to see this represented by the leaders of the shelter, potentially board members, but also shelter guests in there, as well as local businesses and neighborhood members. We really want an outside facilitator in that so that we have these kind of discussions happening and we can engage the community. We definitely want a selection process and some term limits so that this is run very efficiently. And we want to weave that creation into the conditional use permit. And we're hoping that this will engage the community and really help with activities, once of course COVID appropriate, such as cleanup days. We'd love to get into the garden and help and really engage both communities with each other. And I think that's how we find this integration. And also we're going to create a clear charge for that board and some accountability. And that gives the neighbors the ability to talk to somebody, a specific person, and say, these are my concerns, and then they can be addressed and those gaps can be found. Okay, we're talking about the proactive and responsive safety plan. We really want to see ahead of this from the neighborhood perspective. I think I heard a lot of concerns from my neighbors about safety, extra policing, sounds, safety for the guests of the shelter on the busy streets. So I think that there are plans in place already, and we'd love to see those before any shelter comes into a neighborhood, specifically fire, medical, police, the mobile crisis units we've been talking about, and street outreach. It may require an additional investment in private security, and that may be where the city leaders need to step in and help with some of those extra expenses for EMS fire. I think there are plans in place. We've seen that through this group, but I don't know that the neighbors got a chance to see all of that, and so it creates a lot of fear.
All right, and then we're going to talk about some appropriate residential buffers. Apparently, there's a draft code coming up, and in the updates, there's a 300-foot residential buffer for shelter homes. Is that going to be the case, and should that be reinforced? You might consider modifying buffer requirements to encourage scattered site models. We recognize that IFS isn't prepared to do that. However, the city needs to look at this at a larger picture. This isn't the only shelter we're ever going to have. Maybe a smaller buffer is required for smaller shelters, how we go forward from there. Consider pre-selecting a site. And this kind of goes into what Tom was mentioning, if you're going through this rewrite of the zoning, maybe adding in some zones where shelters are appropriate so that we can get more integrated into neighborhoods and prepare for that ahead of time. That might be considered so that way we can have some predictable developmental patterns. Future development surrounding the pre-selected sites would go in there with knowledge that that is pre-selected for emergency housing or group community housing. And then as Tom's group mentioned too, the conditional use permit accountability, we really like to see some outline on that. I'm personally not very familiar with this process, but from some of our group members were. And we'd like to see that that's actually outlining in more detail what the modification process is. It's one thing to get the conditional use permit, but then let's say the shelter wants an additional 50 beds. There should be a way to modify that works with the community and with a community engagement. So it's not just an administrative process, but it's also something that the community can engage in. There needs to be a review period and of course, we keep mentioning this enforcement structure for the conditional use permit. And I believe that is all I have. Mine was not as exciting as Tom's, and Tom's is now, he's gonna do my slides forever and always.
I'll give you pictures of my dog.
Yeah, no
I
cat
need more cat and
pictures.
dog pictures.
Thank you, Jen. Feedback for group 2. Yes, Penny.
Yeah, Penny Beach. I'm a little concerned about the zoning restrictions. Like talk about the buffers, just because it seems to me if you had even more zoning restrictions, Interfaith would never have found any site. So I'm a little concerned about them erasing the possibility of there being any shelter. So I guess my ask would be to have the zoning laws looked at in a holistic manner. So that they made sense. Because obviously, if you allow shelters in 24 out of 24 zones in the city, you're probably going to be able to find more suitable sites. But if you left that 4 out of 24 and then started putting in restrictions on top of that, you're never going to have a shelter in the city.
Thank you. Yes, Hillary.
Hi. So I think a lot of what Penny just said is something that I've started to hear reiterated through this task force over the past week, is that had we applied any additional restrictions to the already inherent ones within city code, we would not have shelter sites anywhere throughout the city. And because the city is undergoing this rewrite process, great timing, everyone, we actually have the ability to proactively look at shelter criteria and sites that meet that.
But I would just add to that, the community criteria didn't make the board of the 6 criteria, and that I feel that should be included in the eventual planning and zoning restrictions.
And just to follow up what Katie just said, absolutely, we couldn't even put community criteria on the current list because we wouldn't have a shelter site.
I'm trying to process. That was a lot of information that came at me at once. I'm trying to think about the recommendation here because we know zoning code is going to be reviewed. That itself is going to be a lengthy and complex process. Is in addition to what we've already heard, is there another ask that you'd like to see added to the recommendation around sort of making sure it's revised in a holistic manner, that there's some sort of community engagement and enforcement process, or are you just underlining what's been said already, Hillary? Okay, Thank you. I just want to make sure I was not missing something through my paralysis here. Okay. Other comments, feedback? We'll hand you a mic over there. Please make sure to introduce yourself for folks online.
I'm Andrew, faith leader. I don't know how to concretely change or suggest a different recommendation, but there's a real timing challenge to how to present a fire policing plan, but also include the community before you've done all the work to come up with a fire and policing plan. And given the conditional use permits and the zoning presentation we had, how big of a plan can you afford to come up with before you even can own the property that may go off the So I don't know how that is played out, but there's a real challenge to have any functional timing plan for this kind of move that ticks off all the boxes.
That feels like a really important point and one that we're hearing echoes of in other comments. And so I might suggest that we'll make sure we capture it here. Either it appears in sort of front materials for the report as the context, and or group 3 could consider building that out a little bit as sort of considerations for decision makers. I'll let you decide. Tom.
This is Tom from the Sunset neighborhood. One thing we talked a lot about and y'all touched on as well was enforcement of the CUPs of the and how that would happen and how that occurs. And one thing we were concerned about was one, equity within that, with it amongst other businesses and organizations, and then number 2, I guess how it's actually enforced, like who actually enforces it. We're not totally sure how they're enforced within the city, but our suspicion is that it's kind of reported. So, for example, if Interfaith Sanctuary said they're going to have a 200-person shelter, but all of a sudden 300 people were there, who's going to know about that unless someone actually who's there reports it to the city?
Okay.
So we were just kind of concerned how that enforcement would happen.
When you say equity, you're worried about unequal enforcement?
We're worried about both. You know, it's
Okay.
kind of, on the one hand, it's unequal enforcement. Okay, because the neighbors are unhappy with this, is it going to get more enforcement than it should? But on the other hand, how is it enforced? Because there are these neighborhood concerns, and where's that middle ground?
I saw Elaine raise her hand. Elaine is a zoning expert, so she might be able to shed some light here.
Yeah, again, clarifying.
Elaine, can you get a little closer to that mic? Thank you.
Sure. Elaine Clegg, City Council President. Little clarification. The zoning code does have an enforcement mechanism for conditional use permits. It goes through our code enforcement office and is enforced just like any code compliance issue would be. However, if they identify something that is out of compliance with the conditions in the conditional use permit, it can also trigger a review of the conditional use permit by the Planning and Zoning Department, and even can come to either the commission or the city council. One of the things I think I'm hearing is that in this day, probably not surprisingly, there's not a lot of trust that any decision that is made is going to be upheld in the way that really serves the community. So I don't know how you overcome the lack of trust, but I will say that in fact, the conditional use permit process is very well spelled out, has a very deep administrative chapter in it. And it might be that part of what we need is education around that. And, you know, those things are always up for review. We spent a year, 2 years ago, looking at just that and making improvements. So not to say that there can't be, you know, improvements made, but instead, yeah, I guess I would urge this group, don't get too down in the weeds on administrative process within the planning and development services. Tell us what the outcome is that you want to see, and we'll figure out the process that's needed to get there.
So maybe one solution for whichever group ends up with this one is around sort of education, communication, transparency around the process to make sure that's accessible and people aren't trying to dig through administrative code and procedures. Okay, good. Any other final comments for group 2 before we move on to our final group? Okay, all right, Rachel. All right, who's presenting for group 3? Oh, group 3 coming up Academy Award style. I like it. Best ensemble cast.
Okay, group 3. So recommendations to leadership. The first one is the city must have enough emergency shelter beds to meet the need. We cannot put 200 people out on the streets, especially during the winter, without any shelter. The last time that happened, people literally froze to death. And then healthcare must have a place to discharge unhoused individuals to. So speaking as the representative for the hospital system, what I probably haven't told people on this task force is that if we have an unhoused individual who is ready to leave the hospital but does not have a safe place to stay where they can continue to get well, we don't just discharge them onto the street. As you can imagine, they will stay in the hospital until we're confident they have a safe place to go. So that often means at both hospitals, there are individuals who basically no longer need hospital care, but are living there. We have patients who live there for days to weeks to months because we cannot find a place to take them. We can't find a nursing home. We can't find an assisted living facility. And if we didn't have a homeless shelter, we couldn't find a homeless shelter to send them. It's gotten super bad during COVID. Because a lot of nursing homes are short-staffed, so they're taking fewer discharges out of the hospital. So we have literally people boarding at the hospitals now at a time when we need those acute care beds as much as possible. When I was on this past weekend, I was taking care of 3 patients who were just housed in the ER because we had no beds to put them in. And this is extremely costly. It's extremely bad healthcare, not only for unhoused individuals, but for the community. We are in support of solutions that would mean that we don't have to have a big emergency shelter forever, like smaller shelters or hopefully housing. But in the meantime, we need to have enough emergency shelter beds for whoever needs them. Does someone else want to do this one?
So I'm just going to read what it says, everyone. So we're just need to document the criteria. So some type of matrix of how we weigh each criteria, because we realize that some of the criteria may have different weighted importance. And so weighting those will be vital. And then the reasons behind what we did this. So I think this is also a really important process outline in that terms of communication for that part.
Just to comment on the last one as well, like it would have been super helpful to know that there was only 4 zones in the city where a shelter could go in at the outset.
Yeah, perfect. It's already up there for you.
Evaluate.
Can I make a quick comment about that? I know everybody's like focused in on that. Uses that have a high impact are limited to fewer zones, always. There's all kinds of them. It's not just shelter. And that's the way zoning works. We could go to a different kind of zoning that wouldn't do that. But anyway, I just want to make that point. this is a high impact use, it should in fact have different criteria than lower impact uses, at least the way zoning works today. Just FYI.
Yeah, it also anyway, never mind, forget it. Evaluate and publish best practices for citing a shelter and how the pros site reflects those practices. I think the first bullet is really hitting what we wanted. How does a business plan of any proposed site address which of the criteria it can't meet? In other words, if there are 6 criteria we get, anyone should get, you're never gonna meet every criteria. But how do we require that a business plan addresses the criteria it admits it doesn't fully meet, and how it will, I don't want to choose the word buffer because that's baggage to now, but how will it address that lack of meeting? Oh, and then we use the example of a buffer. I was not going to name that elephant, but sure, we can name that elephant.
I can do that.
There you go.
But it would be any criteria.
Okay, this is our last slide. It maybe gets at the elephant in the room slide. So we just wanted to recommend to our political leaders that either they make the difficult decisions, in this case around shelter siting, or truly, if they're going to create a task force, truly empower us to do that, or at the least, it seems like our goals weren't clearly established at the beginning, or they changed halfway through. So if that could be clear from the beginning, I think that would be helpful.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks, group 3. All right, we'll get you some feedback here. Recommendations for leadership. B.
So yeah, B Black WCA. I'm not quite sure exactly where these fit, but one of the things that occurred to me as I was, again, listening to everything is there's a real concern about the distance between this proposed shelter and Corpus Christi and the other services catch and in the downtown core. And I think we should recommend that we take a serious look at transportation between the new shelter site and where the services, where the appropriate services are located. Because to me, it seems like it's a great site given the bus there, but then I don't really know what the bus schedule is. So, are we meeting the needs as far as the individuals that we would be serving? The other thing is I've spent quite a bit of time reading and having others read the CPTED report. And I think it needs to be interpreted for people, because I think you can look at it and say, oh my gosh, this is so concerning. But really, in comparison to what? I think that it was what was lacking in my mind is what other section is it compared to? To take a comparison of a relatively small area versus the whole city doesn't tell me much. And if you look at the percentages look terrible. But if you look at the numbers are very small. And if you look at what I think, I heard a lot of neighbors being very worried about is the crime rate and the types of crimes. It gave crime rates in the area, but it didn't give a comparison to what was going on in the rest of the city. And there was no comparison that said, here's what the population was back in 2016. Here's what the population is in 2020. So relative to what? So I think that, if anybody really read through that report, unless you have some broader discussion around it and some context, I think it could be very alarming to neighbors. And I don't think that's fair. So I guess one of the recommendations I would have is that there could maybe be some follow-up work done, maybe some work done around the new area and the already existing area as the project moves forward. So just a thought.
I mean, it seems uncontroversial that any statistics that are introduced should be put in context and interpreted. That could certainly be a recommendation of this group. Jody?
I just wanted to address the transportation issue in the better practices for shelter. The services that are currently where Interfaith Sanctuary is, we're moving those services into this new proposed project. So we would have a day shelter, Catch would be in the building, Mail would be in the building. So what we were trying to do in this design was to take pressure off of the only daytime shelter. So we don't actually want to have that crossover. Our shelter will serve the guests within our building. Corpus Christi will stay intact and serve the unsheltered and the guests that utilize the other shelters in the downtown core. And so transportation to that core should not have an effect. And if it did, we would find shuttle service or something, but the crossover shouldn't happen with a new shelter, with a day shelter.
So it could be that maybe you and Jody can get together and see if there's language that you could agree on that we could put before the group in the written form that might meet both of your concerns or address both the concern and the response here. Other comments for group 3? Okay, Stephanie. Glad I took that extra breath.
Sorry about that. So I don't know if this is a broader thing than this conversation, but we, as the provider community, as our path home, have been talking for years about how do we proactively know when a project like this is going to be happening, and how do we gather around it to make sure that it has the support that it needs. And so I don't know internally through the city, like what that would look like, but some kind of, I know that like next week, this is what's going to be on the council's agenda, or like this is what's coming up, but I don't know if there's like a process that we could create for special projects that includes connecting our path home or other partners in that process more toward the front end of a project. If that makes any sense. That might have been confusing. It makes sense in my head, but it didn't make as much sense when it was coming out.
I think you could propose language for your subcommittee that we can take a look at for sure.
That concept hit another concept for me for early on, which is the lack of data we experience, because we should be able to have data to give us a somewhat better planning horizon as the population grows. What's the expectation of the implications to the different groups? And I think that this is just an offering, but I think that was very early on. It was clear we do not know everything we'd like to know to be able to plan in this space. So those two things, at least for me, have a relationship.
Okay, one more comment, Jody?
I think to add on to Stephanie, I think what we saw as a problem in this process was that we are meeting and discussing as our path home, and that information is not being passed over to city council or to the mayor. And so what happens is there's a lack of knowledge going into the process. And so when neighbors wanted to talk to their city council leaders didn't have the language because they hadn't gone through the process with us. And so I think if there is a direct connect with city council when these projects are being built, so that city council can know and be able to not just represent the neighbors, but also bring that to the project so that it's not so fraught. So city council being directly connected with our Path Home moving projects forward would be the proposed communication.
I hear you. It sounds good. I think how it's proposed matters, because I could see a community member saying, well, that sounds like there's some sort of inside deal happening, right? So there has to be transparency into that process at some point and in some way. Tom, last comment for reals this time.
Oh, this is the last one?
Yeah, make it good. No pressure.
Oh, great. This is Tom. I kind of disagree with that, Jody. I think we want to keep there's some sort of separation, like Jen just said, between city council. And I think the onus might be a little bit more on the shelter in our Path Home to educate the public. So they don't have to go to city council. And then after they're educated, to still go to city council. That's just the way I feel about that. And hope that was a mic drop comment as we end the comment section.
Oh, man, that's a really powerful hand up. What am I going to ignore it? Go ahead. Andrew, please introduce yourself.
Andrew Scoggin, with the board of directors of Interfaith Sanctuary. I'm going to agree, obviously, with what Tom indicates as concerns. And we actually asked our board, don't go try to have private lobbying conversations and put city council members in uncomfortable positions or any of that. And so I think that's a very careful path that you've got to walk, where you don't put the city council into a position of, oh, you only heard from one side, or any of these other things. So when you're putting that together, be really careful not to put city council in a very difficult rock and a hard place on that one.
Can you hand out handouts? Thank you for that comment. I was listening. Okay, so we have a quick process discussion we need to have before you get back into your groups. We're going to hand out a draft schedule around report writing, just to give you a sense of how we think the process will go from here, because trying to wordsmith as a group would make us all not want to do anything anymore. Try to avoid stigmatizing language here. Here's what I need to know is we heard some new things today, and I think there will be some changes or adjustments made to recommendations based on the feedback. I would hope so. But it will be tricky for those of us who will be trying to pull all of this together to figure out how to handle totally new information, right? So if there are new things that get put forward by subcommittee leaders based on this conversation, that makes sense. But if a subcommittee comes up with, say, a totally new recommendation that hasn't been discussed by this body, that puts us in the awkward position of having to try to decide, is this really a consensus position? Do you understand what I'm saying? So could we agree to just some very brief, simple guidelines for how you will give us feedback at this point? Because what we anticipate happening is the subcommittee chairs will give us your updated recommendations based on the conversation today. We'll put that into reporty like language and then send back to everybody for your feedback, which we'll try our best to address your concerns in that around language and things like that. But if individuals give us new recommendations at that point, that'd be hard for us to include those. So what am I asking for here? What I'm asking for is what do you reasonably expect from us in terms of getting the report drafted and to you and incorporating your feedback?
I'm not sure I have the answer to that question, but one point I would like to interject is I don't think everyone should feel like you have to go back to the beginning and try to remember the recommendations or topics we've been discussing since the beginning. I would like to ask staff to make sure any of those were encompassed. Like, for example, I can think of community outreach that's come up in all these meetings and had different components and different aspects to perhaps give you back the most comprehensive recommendation we believe we heard, so that you all don't have to go back and try to remember all the things. We have those records, those recordings. And so part of this, at least in my mind, is to have staff bring what they've heard through the whole process, in addition to the recommendations today, and any tweaks or adds, but not whole new concepts.
I mean, just to put that another way, I think the staff will work very hard to capture the spirit of what you have put forward and to put meat on those bones in an effective way. But you will also have a chance to make comments on that. Concerns about that as part of the process? Suggestions you would like to make adjusting that? Okay, I will take that silence as approval for now. If you want to talk to me separately, please do. I'd like to go ahead and leave you the rest of the time today to go back to your subcommittees. Subcommittee chairs may want to do a little wrangling about who's going to take what topics, subtopics. Oh, Andrew, sorry. Okay, you're gonna have to speak into the mic.
And given that we are presumably all at least signing off our name onto this document, is there a approval that happens on after that Friday, the 10th, of the final document? Like, are you expecting that you will give it to us and we will say, I approve putting that as the final document? Or
So you, in other words, you'd like to suggest another step. So people give feedback and then we incorporate that feedback, comes back to you for final approval. Other Andrew?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Andrew from the Board of Interfaith Sanctuary. I want to add to that. I hate to put anything more on anyone's calendar, including mine, but given where we're at and that this is all going to be brought together, and this group has worked so closely together on all of this, I wonder whether that 10th, we don't come back for one last, we're all here, instead of everyone sort of emailing in their thoughts and feelings.
Yeah, and I would want to make clear too that I didn't anticipate that the whole group would be replied all on every revision either, in case that just terrified some of you. Well, we will try to compile feedback and make sense of it. There's a proposal for a meeting.
More, an hour or less.
This is Penny Beach. I don't know if I agree with the meeting, but I do agree with having final approval on the final report.
I meet for living, so another meeting is perfectly fine with me. But to that end, and to Andy's point, to, I think, protect the tone, the spirit of the conversations, trying to do that by email is, and I feel bad for the staff who's going to bring me challenges because they're not in context coming through email. So my only caveat is it doesn't extend the timeline out any further than we're currently at. So then if we went forward with that, and maybe we can find something on the 9th so that the staff can have a bit longer to turn it around. So the staff would collect everything they've heard from the beginning, everything from this room and the task force, put it together in our closest attempt for a final document, and then we come up with a process for support, approval, whatever the terms are. Does that work for everybody? I think that's fine. Be flexible with your schedules, though. This is going to get a little challenging. B, did you have some?
So sorry, clarification. So are you saying that instead of Wednesday, September 1st, the draft would be the 9th?
We would work on it. We'd come back to you. I was just quickly looking at this timeline. I don't think we want to wait till the 10th.
No. But then could we meet on September 13th to do the in-person? Because it doesn't seem realistic to get the final draft on Friday and meet on Friday.
Maybe rather than try to figure this out right now, I think we'll take the recommendation's a good one to make sure we have that sort of approval step in, and a meeting might make sense for that. So we'll revise this schedule. We'll make sure to communicate that with you. And then if a meeting is what is called for, we'll get that scheduled. Sarah.
In looking at the 8 minutes that we have left today and the conversation around the timeline and final approval, I'm wondering for my fellow task force members, it makes sense to me that rather than trying to figure out, I'm wondering how you feel about this, what recommendation should live under what category, we let the staff just determine where it feels like it fits best and combine the recommendations where there is overlap instead of trying to work that out in 7 minutes.
I'm seeing nods. Is it okay to agree to that by acclamation? Does anybody disagree with that as an approach?
Is there still going to be a draft that's going to go out before the end of this week? I'm just wondering because I'm totally unreachable next week. from
That's
Sunday
the
through
plan.
Thursday.
That's the
Okay.
plan, is for everybody to see the draft, the revised draft by the end of this week.
I appreciate Sarah's recommendation because I think your time is better spent coming up with recommendations, not where they should go or how, like in which category. We can sort that out. You may not love it, which you're going to be able to tell us, but we can at least give it our best shot. Before we wrap up, is there anything else we need to consider? So what I believe we've said is we will adapt this timeline. We will return this to you probably by the end of the day, so everyone knows what our next steps are. I want to again express my appreciation for everyone coming today and being willing to participate and be flexible as we work towards the best product that we can. So I've been seeing a lot of emails to me, which is fantastic. Those will all be part of the record. So the other thing the staff is doing is doing a collection of all the emails that we've received on this topic. And by we, I mean the city as a whole. So you don't have to send the same email to the police chief and to me. Like, we can find all of that and put it as part of the record. If anything else comes up or anybody has any questions, just let me know. And with that, thanks again, everybody. I appreciate it. Yes.
Could I also just say thanks to everyone for participating? All of us are really passionate people. We care a lot about what we do. And sometimes it's really hard when you get a group of passionate people together to make this kind of progress. And so I want to thank you all individually for participating and participating honestly as good brokers for your particular passion. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Stay in touch. Well, you'll hear from us.